What did the president know, and when did he know it?
For 3 decades, that question has lingered. Tonight, one former White House aide, for the first time, provides his surprising answer.
But I could hear enough to know that Nixon was saying, we want Liddy to break into the Watergate. Well, I thought we were in serious trouble. I mean, I thought the end was possibly near, that we had gone beyond the bounds of what we should have ethically and legally.
Jeb Stuart Magruder was second in command at the committee to re-elect the president.
And now we were caught in this hell of a trap. Probably it was not going to end up well.
Bob Haldeman, his chief of staff, shielded Nixon from everyone, even cabinet members. A directive from either of them, the staff understood, came from the president himself.
Most people in the White House that worked for Nixon had good private morality. They were, I've often said, John Ehrlichman, Bob Haldeman, they were good Christian scientists. They didn't, drink, smoke, or chase women. I often said in Washington, that's very difficult. But so they had a good context for private morality. But when it came to public morality, they didn't get it, or they didn't want to get it.
Working below Haldeman and Ehrlichman was a staff of young aides. Jeb Magruder was 34.
Here you are at the center of the world's greatest superpower. The trappings, the chauffeured limos, the state dinners, the guard saluting you when you go in and out. And I remember going on some of Air Force One or two at times, and I was a PFC when I was in Korea. Nobody saluted me then. But when I was in the White House, everybody saluted you. And so we all had this feeling of omnipotence, that we were very important. And in some ways we were, but it was only temporary. I remember I was in, it was after the November 3rd speech in 1969, his first Vietnam speech. And it was accepted and well accepted by the press and by the people. But there was one person, he knocked the speech. And then someone, I think it was Henry Kissinger, said, well, he's an agent of some communist country in Europe. The president got very annoyed. And he looked at me and he said, Jeb, we ought to get that guy. And I'm sitting here saying, I wonder what that means. So after the meeting, I go back to Haldeman's office and I say, Bob, the president said something about getting that guy. Do you know what he meant? And Haldeman said, you heard him, get him.
Hunt and Liddy, as well as the Cuban Americans recruited for the break-in, had botched their mission, but they had not been caught.
These people were not good burglars. They were bunglers. And so then when that didn't work and they wanted to get them out of there, that's how I inherited them over at the committee to re-elect.
Bud Krogh has apologized, not only to me, but a lot of others, for sticking me with Gordon Liddy.
I was, in a sense, told to hire him, and that he had other abilities. I wasn't quite sure what that meant.
A decade before he ended up in the White House, and then at the committee to re-elect the president, Gordon Liddy had worked for the FBI.
He once volunteered to Ehrlichman to kill Dean and I. And fortunately, Ehrlichman said, no, I don't think we need to do that. So when you get somebody like that at a lower level, then you have pressure at a higher level, things are going to happen.
President Nixon tried to portray himself as above the political fray. On June 1st, 1972, he crowned a trip to the Soviet Union with a dramatic arrival on Capitol Hill.
The President of the United States.
He was the first American president to visit the Soviet Union, and he returned to announce that the two superpowers had agreed to a détente. The election was 5 months away. Polls showed he was far ahead of the man who would be named the Democratic nominee, George McGovern. But Nixon had his own secret spy operation in place, and it was a simple next step to use it in the presidential campaign.
You know, people say to me, well, why did you do Watergate? Because you didn't need it. Absolutely correct. We didn't need it at all. But Nixon always wanted more information. He just felt that was the way to keep himself on top and everyone else on the bottom.
The election was 5 months away. Polls showed he was far ahead of the man who would be named the Democratic nominee, George McGovern. But Nixon had his own secret spy operation in place, and it was a simple next step to use it in the presidential campaign.
You know, people say to me, well, why did you do Watergate? Because you didn't need it. Absolutely correct. We didn't need it at all. But Nixon always wanted more information. He just felt that was the way to keep himself on top and everyone else on the bottom. I get a phone call, and it's Liddy. And he says, well, my guys got caught last night at the Watergate. And I sort of said something like, well, you know, that's too bad, but, you know, as you and I talked, they're not connected at all with us. He said, well, that was true, but unfortunately, because you put me under such time pressure, I had to ask Jim McCord to help us. Well, Jim McCord worked for us as our security chief. And as soon as I heard that word, those words, I almost died, because I said, a direct link to us.
And that meant the bungled burglary had become a key that could open the door on years of illegal activities. Because two of the burglars, along with Gordon Liddy and Howard Hunt, were on the plumbers team that had broken into the office of Ellsberg's psychiatrist.
They know about the Ellsberg break-in. They did the Ellsberg break-in. And so if one of them talks, then it goes right back to Ehrlichman, right back to the president.
Inside the White House, 3 days later.
Start to get all the circumstantial stuff. Maybe it's better not to, maybe better just to plead guilty. Yeah, we were spying on the Democrats. They got to plead guilty, getting stuff on the Democrats, and we went in there to get this because we're scared to death that this crazy man's going to become president and sell the U.S. out to the communists. How does the president know? They don't. Oh, they know that's about because they found his name in the address book of two of the Cubans that he's identified as White House. We got a committee who's worried about it. That's my vote, except for this.
There really never was a sort of a sit-down session where everybody said, okay, how do we cover this up? How do we conspire to obstruct justice? How do we stop this from getting out of hand? It didn't happen that way. It happens a small increment at a time, and it is a reaction to the politics of it. And the politics of it are, it is not the White House covering up for a bungled burglary at the re-election committee. It is the White House that's covering up for the earlier bungled activities of Hunt and Liddy and the men who are now in jail who were part of that, that dropped this right back at the president's doorstep. It was something we just couldn't walk away from.
There was an unbelievable sense that Nixon, in a sense, was God. You might not like him personally. You know, again, our polling showed don't have a beer. Nobody wanted to have a beer with him. But he was this brilliant man. China had already occurred now. The Russian détente had occurred. And so things were going very well. And why let this little incident kill the presidency?
In the letter that Judge Sirica read aloud in the courtroom, McCord told what he knew. Political pressure, he said, had been applied on the burglars to keep silent. There had been perjury during the trial, and he would name names. One of them was John Dean. Another was Jeb Magruder.
Mitchell says, well, you need to hire an attorney. just don't tell him the truth. So I go down and hire some good lawyers, and this one guy was very good. And one day he comes into my office and says, you know, Jeb, that's a great story you've told to the FBI, the prosecutors, the grand jury, and the trial. He said, do you know much about perjury? And I said, well, you know, we're not supposed to tell a lie under oath. He said, well, yes, but every time you tell one, it's a count. You know, it counts 5 years. So if any of what you've said is not true under oath, that's perjury. And every time you do it, it's another count. And oh, by the way, did you know that John Dean's down talking to the prosecutors? I said, what? I said, I can't believe that. He said, oh yeah, he's talking to the prosecutor. And guess who he is indicating has done this? And I said, well, who? He said, you. I said, what? So I go home that night. I get the transcripts. And I start counting. I forget how many, but you know, it was 40 or 80 or who knows how many counts of perjury. I multiply that by 5. That's a long time. So the next day I go down and say, well, I guess we better talk.
It would become the most dramatic inquiry in the history of the nation as Americans watched the hearings broadcast live.
This was a premier moment for Sam Irwin, for Howard Baker, from both Democrats and Republicans, because by then, even our friends who were on our side in the election were talking about us as being probably the most evil people in the world ever.
Like the rest of the country, the White House was watching the televised hearings.
But actually, he's working out pretty well at Manhattan. Mitchell came across as a mature and tough guy. Really? Yes. I didn't see much of him, but what I saw, he impressed me. And compared to these lacquered, selfish little bastards like Gruder and Dean, at least you could see why Mitchell wasn't a subject for Charles. In fact, what I do, cut off 2 arms. Well, who the hell else would have considered that? Who had ever done that before? Now, they cut out 2 arms and they went after the body. So. Then you consider the massive things you had done for the country. Sometimes you can't compromise. So we'll have a constitutional crisis. If we do, it will be a goddamn ding-dong battle.
On the anniversary of the Watergate break-in, Jeb Magruder began his testimony.
I don't think anybody sat around, at least I didn't, thinking about doing unethical, illegal activities. But when things did come up, even though you knew they were wrong, well, it was the President of the United States, it was John Ehrlichman, Bob Haldeman, and therefore you were many times willing to sort of ignore what was going on. My approach was, well, this is not important, and I'm not going to worry about it. Yes, it's illegal. I knew it was illegal, unethical. But I said, well, it's great working here in the White House, and so on.
Magruder would tell the committee the decision to fund illegal espionage was a throwaway decision, a small item in a busy meeting of the top men in the campaign.
Mr. Magruder, I'm not clear in my mind about who originated the idea of the clandestine intelligence operation and when that was done.
Well, Mr. Liddy was brought over to me at the committee in December, and I was told that he would handle our intelligence gathering operations by Mr. Dean. He indicated that Mr. Mitchell had approved this. We did not discuss in detail in that meeting what these operations would be.
When called before the Senate committee, Gordon Liddy had taken advantage of his rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution. He chose to remain silent.
The first I had any indication of what Liddy was doing in the intelligence gathering business over at the Re-election Committee was when Jeb Magruder called me and said, Liddy is going to have his first meeting with John Mitchell, who was still Attorney General and hadn't come over to run the campaign. And he's going to present his intelligence plans to Mitchell. He said, maybe you should go over as well, since you've got the White House responsibility for this stuff.
John Dean called me about Gordon Liddy coming over to work for us. I didn't know him. He came over. I found him personally very unpleasant and not somebody I would normally have hired. And clearly, he had been told when he left the White House to prepare a plan to elevate dirty tricks to a different level.
And I went over to what was one of the most amazing meetings I've ever attended, any time, any place. Gordon Liddy had an easel set up. He proceeds to present his intelligence plans through these charts that he's put on the easel that are all in code names. And he is calling for things like a chase plane being a smaller jet aircraft that would fly around an opposing candidate's plane and intercept ground-air communication.
Could you give us, to your best recollection, what some of these projects were?
There was, of course, the projects including wiretapping, electronic surveillance, and photography. There were projects relating to the abduction of individuals, particularly members of radical groups. We were concerned about the convention in San Diego.
Liddy said, well, and I've got a solution to that, General, as he referred to Mitchell. He said, I actually have available the services of some highly trained men who are experienced in kidnapping, and they will kidnap the leaders of the anti-war movement, take them below the Mexican border, drug them, and put them out of commission during the time that the convention is being held in San Diego, so they won't be a threat at all.
And that they would then be returned to this country at the end of the convention. He had another plan which would have used women as agents to work with members of the Democratic National Committee and at their convention and here in Washington, and hopefully through their efforts they would obtain information from them.
Jeb Stuart Magruder pled guilty to obstructing justice. By his own accounting, he was in prison 7 months, 8 days, and 11 hours.
The question at this point is simply put, what did the president know, and when did he know it?
It is a question that has gone unanswered for 3 decades. But Jeb Magruder, now a retired Presbyterian minister, has finally decided to tell what he claims to have witnessed. At this moment, we have only his word.
We went down together, and I had about 25 decision papers because Mitchell had been so sort of off track with these other issues. So we meet in the morning, and we go through the first 24, and they're typical campaign decisions about polling, advertising, whatever.
The day was Thursday, March 30th, 1972. Attorney General Mitchell, the head of the campaign to re-elect the president, met with his deputy, Magruder. Gordon Liddy's proposal to bug the telephone of the chairman of the National Democratic Party, Larry O'Brien, was the last item they discussed.
We didn't like the idea. It was going to the Watergate Democratic National Committee headquarters and bugging Larry O'Brien's phone. So Mitchell said, call Haldeman and find out, do we really have to, is this really important? So I call Haldeman, and he talks to me, and I say, we're not sure it's worth doing. And Haldeman said, yes, the president wants it done. He said, is John there? And I said, yes. And I give the phone to John, and Haldeman talks to him. And then the president comes on the line and talks to Mitchell. I could hear the president talking to him, and it was simply, John, we need to get the information on Larry O'Brien. The only way we can do that is through Liddy's plan, and you need to do that. Nixon was saying, we want Liddy to break into the Watergate. Mitchell gets off the phone and says to me, he says, well, Jeb, tell Maury Stans to give Liddy $250,000 and let's see what happens.